All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. It looks like we have a decent amount of people on the line, so we'll get started. So welcome to Hotwire's webinar, bringing the human element forward. So we are a top-ranked global communications consultancy that works with industry leaders and major brands to create and drive PR and marketing initiatives. And today we're here to talk about the real and present need to bring the human element forward and how we operate as comms professionals. And really, how do we look at ways to help executives and organizations approach comms in a more human and really more effective way? So for the next 45 minutes or so, you'll hear from me and my colleagues with analysis and recommendations on how to bring the human element forward based on examples we're seeing out there in the world, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. But please feel free to engage in the chat. We'd love to see any engagement. Drop questions as we go, thoughts, comments, questions for us or the other attendees. And at the end of this, we're hoping that you leave with some new ideas on how to approach your executive and corporate comms this year in light of the challenges that are in front of us. So as we start to kick off, what are those challenges? And it's really, we're seeing very low trust in corporations and executives at all-time lows across media coverage, social networks, from employees, every industry, everywhere. And of course, the big trends that are either driving this or created by this, we'll talk about both, are things like the Great Resignation, work reform, the pandemic. But this tone, we really believe, dictates how you should be thinking about corp comms for society in 2022. So we'll start off with a few examples of where we are and where we came from. I think we all know 2021, just like 2020, was a pretty challenging year for all of us in corporate exec comms, and that's a trend that is continuing. Everything's new, everything is a new challenge in a lot of different ways. Last year, we saw the role of the CEO really come to the fore and the CEO's responsibility for new issues, tackling new issues and being responsible for those new issues. And that definitely continues, but now we're going into the new normal. And I'm sorry, everyone, for the buzzword, but it works. It explains where we're at right now. It's a new normal where the CEO and their entire executive team are held accountable by a larger and larger group of stakeholders. DEI definitely still very incredibly important, but from 2021 to 2022, it's really starting to dovetail with larger conversations around employee experience, workplace policy, employee rights, and even how companies measure growth and results, right? And as we all know, companies are increasingly called on to show where they're at when it comes to DEI and hiring, upskilling people, sustainability, carbon impact, and really more and more of these metrics every day. And so as we talk to Hotwire clients and reporters, everyone's trying to figure it out, right? How do we speak in a world that has been transformed? And there's another buzzword for you, but it's true, right? This industry has been transformed in so many ways. So before we start talking about how we're going to tackle it, I'll start a question off for all the attendees. What's top of mind for you right now? What's the question top of mind for you about the challenges that you're going to tackle this year in this new environment? And feel free to drop it into the chat anytime. So in this new environment, change is not enough. We live in a world where everything is new. It's the new normal. How do we adapt? And the philosophy that we want to really sort of embody here is you can't just change in real time. You can't change to respond to situations as they emerge. Change is no longer enough. You have a larger and larger base of stakeholders who need and want to see change, but they also need to feel it in really direct ways, and they need that to happen for the long term. So do we really have to transform for the long term? And we would say that these numbers say, yes, we do. So 57% of employees would choose not to work for a company that doesn't align with them for their moral values. And that number is going to grow pretty quickly, I would believe, as more Gen Z workers come into the offices. At the same time, 82% of people are saying their organization lacks fairness. I mean, these are the numbers, or at least some of them, behind the Great Resignation, right? There's this demand for employees, from employees, to keep organizations accountable and aligned with what they believe is right and the right way to do things. We're seeing some progress, right? Nearly every CEO is acknowledging that they have a role, and their organization has a role in climate change and the climate crisis. people are investing in DEI initiatives, and we are seeing good traction and metrics for success there. But there's opportunities and challenges, and we really believe being more human is your path to addressing them. But that said, why are we the ones who are here to tell you about all this? We'll go through a quick round of intros for the team that will be presenting today. I'm John O'Leary, Senior Director here at Hotwire with a specialty in thought leadership. I've been lucky to work across really a large swath of startups and major tech brands globally, speaking with executives to really help them create and tell their stories in a more human and more impactful way. And I'm really happy to be here. What I love about this work is really when an exec buys into the story, right? And then they want to tell it themselves, and it kind of gets those legs that you see trickle across the media ecosystem.
Hi, I'm Nikisha Maddox. I'm a senior manager on our corporate exec comms team. My favorite part of the work that we do is really helping comms leads build and also execute on narratives that help their people talk about their personal values, their corporate values, in a way that moves thought leadership forward, that moves the needle on DE&I, and ultimately that helps comms really support business goals. I specialize in the marketing and commerce industries, and I focus largely on events and program curation, as well as coaching speakers on how to most effectively deliver their presentations, especially virtually where it's hard to hold attention. So thank you for giving us yours today.
Hi, I'm Meg Sanford. I am a senior associate at Hotwire, and I focus primarily on corporate and executive comms, both internally at Hotwire and externally with clients. A big focus within my role is industry event support, where I consult my teams on selecting the most relevant industry events and then support our speakers and clients from the planning phase through to the final execution of the event. I also work with companies in the AI and social media spaces, focusing on media strategy, narrative development, and multiple types of thought leadership initiatives.
And hi, I'm Charlene Gage. I'm a senior manager of media strategy here in San Francisco for Hotwire. I focus on making that connection between the narratives from the corporate level, the business storylines, and connecting those to the trends, the journalists, the newsroom, the publishers that have the right audience for that message. I love digging in with companies ranging from Fortune 500s to nonprofits to startups to post IPOs with executives from the C-suite, VPs, managers, you name them. I love to work with them. And what I really love about this role and the opportunity that we've been seeing over the last year and 2 years, especially with the pandemic and the shifting narratives and landscape within media specifically, is how do we bring that human element forward? And that's what I love doing, and that's what I'm here for. And we see this playing out in headlines especially. I mean, I know everyone here is probably so familiar. They've felt it, they've seen it, they've read it, the Great Resignation and reshuffling. These kind of headlines have been dominating publishers, especially those business publications. And this is where we see things like values playing out across the media and with our stakeholders, the shakeups. What are executives and companies doing to pull in new employees to fill the gap? Or what are they doing to keep that retention low or high retention, make sure that their employees are happy and staying with who they are? Publications are building out to focus specifically on this beat, like Protocol, Wall Street Journals. We're seeing these kind of pubs build out their bench of reporters and editors, with editors focusing on leadership, new reporters highlighting career and workplaces to specifically dive in deep with our corporate and executive spokespeople to get an understanding of what are their values and what are they doing. These same kind of issues are playing out on a global community scale. We know climate change is really top of mind. This includes something also like supply chain, which was massive going into the end of 2021 and still having an impact going into this year as well. What is the responsibilities these businesses have to their customers, to their stakeholders, to the communities that they're involved in living within as well? What are they doing from a sustainable practice? Are they implementing new ways? Are they investing in new areas? What are they thinking about as far as 5 years, 10 years, 1 year into the future when they think about these global issues? All of these questions and topics we have seen in publications across headlines, features, roundups focus, especially over the last 6 months. And it's something that we're going to see continue into 2022. And that's what we want to dive into with this presentation.
So here's what we'll cover today. You heard from John some examples of how corporate and exec comms is impacting all stakeholders. You heard from Charlene what this is looking like in the media today. I'm sure mostly everyone on this call, if not everyone, agrees that our roles as comm professionals has really evolved a lot, especially over the past couple of years. We're not limited to media relations, content plans, executive statements. Our work is more pivotal than it ever has been for really essential parts of the business. We're talking employee retention, navigating critical issues like climate change and public health crises, and doing and proving real tangible work for social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So next, we'll move into our 3 A's of resilient leadership, which are the framework for effectively addressing these things in your comm strategies. If you joined us for last year's webinar, welcome back. But in January 2021, these 3 A's were first introduced. They are the same, but how we apply them really has to evolve with the media landscape and stakeholder priorities. So the 3 A's are accountability, authenticity, and action. And I've already seen a couple of notes in the chat asking about how we get there with authenticity, how we use our speaker bench. We'll cover all of that. So we're perfectly in time for that. And we also have them in a triangle here intentionally. And that's because they all must work in tandem in order to be truly effective. So it's possible to have 1 or 2 of these. You may have had your own strategies where you have 1 or 2 of these or seen others. But what we find is that that's what leaves holes in comm strategies. And that's what creates leaders who have weak spots that ultimately will impact stakeholder trust and can cause harm or affect your bottom line. So the idea here is to bring the 3 A's into all of your strategies and plans so your leaders can be resilient in the face of major and, as we've seen, sometimes unexpected challenges. So we'll head into some examples now, and a reminder, if you have any questions along the way, you can drop them in the Q&A feature and we'll answer those at the end.
Cool. Thanks, Nikisha. So let's start off with our first of the 3 A's, accountability. So when we think about how to apply the idea of resilient leadership and ways to bring the human element forward in accountability, it means finding ways to take accountability as an organization and for executives within an organization in new ways, some of which are more fearless, some of which are more transparent, some of which are more strategic than ever before. And I think we really have to be acknowledging for ourselves as comms professionals and the channels that are often the ones developing and spreading these messages, that executives and organizations, what they do and say matters and are important to the public record, and that taking accountability is not just a rapid response situation or a reactive negative situation to be in. It can be a positive opportunity. So let's look at some examples of what that looks like. So I think first and foremost, again, as Charlene said, we don't want to beat the dead horse of the Great Resignation and some of these other trends that are happening, but they very much inform what the landscape looks like today. Employee first is a really big, important component of all this, because one reason behind the growing need for proactive accountability, it's coming from employees having a stronger and more visible voice than ever before. And I'm sure you've seen this. It started with Glassdoor in a lot of ways. It's expanded now with huge communities on Reddit that are naming and shaming organizations that they have a poor experience working for. And we also see, of course, that reporters have taken notice. And as our Charlene said, there's way more people on this beat now that are looking at, what are you doing? What are you doing to help your employees? And how are you talking about what you're doing? So to look at some examples here, it's all about employee experience in the new world, the new normal, sorry, not sorry, and how companies are showing up in that context, whether it's COVID safety or improving employee experience, acknowledging mental health and burnout. Employees care about all these issues, so reporters care about them too. To spotlight a little bit here, I'm sure everyone is well aware, COVID responses and how companies have adapted different protocols for the pandemic have been both complimented and dinged. So it definitely represents both a challenge and an opportunity depending on how your organization reacted to that. And surely as we continue to see new strains and new issues, this will continue. I think the HR function, is really important to have a great alignment with them, given everything we're seeing here. Any sort of element of retention can get put in the magnifying glass now. And again, whether from a business perspective and you have leadership to offer to the market of how your organization is doing that, or whether it's an issue you need to get in front of and acknowledge that you're taking accountability for past issues and finding ways to grow. So I think the opportunity here overall is to make sure that corp and exec comms are delivered to employees transparently, that you do have an employee first mentality as a communications team, as to the degree that you're able, and you're as transparent as you can be. Ways to do this: frequently communicating results against stated goals, warts and all, even when those numbers don't look great. Bring those into town halls, all hands, other meetings. Work with your executives to find their comfort level on what can and should be discussed. I think when you take accountability with employees in this more proactive way, another thing to consider is that you're equipping them to have a more positive voice for your organization and the messages that are going to demonstrate that there has been investment from your leaders and the org in going in the right direction and getting ahead of negative sentiments. Moving up to our next, I guess I would say, pillar under accountability. In this new normal, again, CEOs must share accountability. So we talked a lot about the role of the CEO and being responsible as the primary spokesperson. And so the reality is, as we know, when something goes very wrong, the CEO will and should be held accountable. But the fallout can be mitigated by sharing accountability across an executive team and building a diverse bench of spokespeople that are true subject matter experts, and hopefully and likely people who are passionate about the subject matter. The CEO is the most important person to represent the org, yeah, but it's not something they have to do or should do alone, especially to the degree as communications professionals, we can help control that. So if we look at some examples here, we talked about the new role of Chief Diversity Officer. Where else are we going to see those new executives and the expansion of the spokesperson bench? We're definitely seeing that in sustainability. And I think one interesting thing there is that we're seeing maybe not a chief sustainability officer everywhere, but in some organizations, we're seeing, for instance, the CIO start to become a spokesperson for sustainability and the decisions that they've made within their org to address carbon footprint and to mitigate the environmental impact of what the company is doing. I think one, really good example here, which is interesting because it's sort of, there's positives and negatives to this person's approach to taking accountability, was Netflix with the Dave Chappelle controversy from October last year. If you think about what happened there that went right, he took accountability. He took it in a little bit too far and too much on a limb for himself. Right. And so the headline was, "I screwed up." Yeah, that's taking accountability. It was courageous to say that. But as comms professionals, right, we know that the juiciest soundbite's going to lead the story. And so Variety picked that up and a number of others did. Now, what would that conversation have looked like if he didn't handle that on his own? If maybe he was a supporting spokesperson alongside their DEI spokesperson. I don't believe they have a chief diversity officer, but they do have someone in the spokesperson role. It's not about passing the buck. It's bringing the experts to the conversation who should be in the conversation to show that you've invested in this area, and people who can connect the dots between the CEO's vision for the business and the broader themes that the audiences we're talking to very much care about when it comes to that.
So where accountability is often more visible in these ways, authenticity is not. Right? Authenticity is measured by how your audiences feel and not by what part of a comms plan you've checked off. This is the point where your comms strategy becomes humanized. So how do we measure authenticity? Well, it's a feeling. Do your audiences and stakeholders feel like you truly understand the issue at hand? Do they believe that you're empathizing the impact it has on them or on a larger scale on society? Do they trust that you're speaking from an informed and human-centric place? These are questions we need to be asking ourselves. So let's go back to Netflix in the middle here. We saw Ted Sarandos taking accountability in the last section. He said, "I screwed up." The problem is that he followed that with he followed that accountability with saying he also wasn't wrong. And then he sent an internal memo that proved he was not at all informed on the true issue or taking time to understand its implications, particularly to the trans community. Where he passed the accountability test, he failed the authenticity test. And when we think about that triangle from the beginning, we know they're needed in tandem. So what happened for Netflix is that one point in that triangle fell out. So instead of being a strong and resilient leader, he became this two-dimensional leader who people don't believe or trust. So let's look now at authenticity in action, what it looks like when you're successful. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the 23andMe headline here because their CEO, Anne Wojcicki, is absolutely phenomenal at this. She's spoken very authentically in the past about the responsibility that comes from the work they do. And recently she started tackling conversations around vaccines in just the same way. So this was an interview that she did, a broadcast interview with Yahoo Finance. And I really recommend looking it up when you have time. She was asked if the increasingly politicized environment around science was making it hard to sell 23andMe products. As a CEO, she easily could have jumped into discussing marketing or revenue or product evolution or those things that we typically will train our CEOs to direct a conversation to. Instead, what she said was that the political tensions are proving a need to consumerize science, because what it's showing is that people are seeking a more human connection to and a more real-world understanding of what's being presented to us. She didn't proclaim to take the place of other scientists. She rather commended foundational organizations like the CDC and the FDA. And then she talked about how they can be supported by new leadership that relates more to everyday people. She sees 23andMe as one of those supports, but not the sole owner. So she didn't bulldoze the conversation and take it over. She's informed, she's real. And what's important here is that she acknowledged what's difficult and what's unknown while also giving her point of view on what's possible and how we can think in new ways. That is authentic leadership. So the question then is, how do we help executives communicate in this authentic way? Not just in the words they say, but how they say them. We have to stop relying on media training alone at the end of the day. Think of how many times, and especially over the past 2 years, examples will probably come to your mind of times that we've seen executives at major corporations flopping in interviews or in their external comms. We can pretty much bet that most, if not all of those, as big brand executives have been media trained, but that's just not enough. So one way to approach this, of how we change this approach, is the concept of simplifying complexity. And this was coined by Adam Bryant. If you aren't familiar, Adam Bryant is a former New York Times reporter who ran a column called Corner Office from 2009 to 2017. And he interviewed CEOs entirely about leadership. He had zero questions about their business. It was all just these evergreen, tell us how you lead. And in his time there, he spoke to over 500 CEOs. So you got a really, in-depth inside knowledge of how they function. And he recently wrote a book called The CEO Test, and he explored the challenges that make or break all leaders. In his work, he says that the cornerstone of leadership is finding this perfect balance of simplicity, where it's broad enough to set direction, yet specific enough to give people clarity around what they should and shouldn't work on. So he talks about having a simple plan, and he chalks it up to, think of the questions that a kid would ask in the back of the car. Where are we going? How are we getting there? When are we arriving? Establishing the answers to those questions as a CEO, and then building a clear rubric for who should be on your teams, what their roles should be. That's what helps you take that complexity and simplify it and also put it into action. So when we look at what this does look like in action, in the middle, you have Bridgewater Associates CEO Ray Dalio, and he came under fire after he compared China's human rights approach to what he said was a quote unquote strict parent. And he said that in a live CNBC broadcast interview. Now, this man knows how to speak to media. He's been trained, he was speaking well, but that didn't help him rather take a beat and respond with empathy and with the values of his stakeholders in mind. After his employees expressed disagreements, he wrote on LinkedIn that he misspoke in a way that caused people to think those were his own opinions or corporate endorsements, which they weren't. And what's interesting about this example is it shows us, what it looks like when media training doesn't automatically equal authenticity. And it also shows us what it looks like to authentically take responsibility for a mistake, because those still happen. And then there's Uber. CEO Dara Khosrowshahi spoke with a UBS analyst in a virtual interview and suddenly made this proclamation that Uber can make any business model work. The problem with that is that if you've been following, Uber has claimed for years exactly the opposite. And that's been their defense for why they need to maintain a gig economy and for why they can't guarantee benefits and labor law protections for all employees. So it's possible that this was a change of heart for the business. But if so, that was completely missed in their comm strategy. It didn't even seem like they really had one. It felt like this off-the-cuff remark, and it resonated as cocky and confusing rather than real and authentic, which is obviously not what we want. And we definitely saw this impact Uber stakeholders, right? Employees were confused about what this meant for them. You can imagine being an investor and finding out about a potential massive business model change and hearing about it on social media or news coverage. It's probably not very fun. And we also haven't seen a true correction of this since, which means that those questions and how people are questioning their CEO's leadership are now being applied to all their subsequent comms because that issue is never fixed. So we can see, through examples, media training is not the end of the road when we're building resilient leaders. Where we go instead lies in the action taken as a company and as a corporate comms team.
So we've discussed that you have to be accountable and authentic in your corporate comms, but those things lose their meaning completely if you don't actually act on it. You have to live and breathe these values and then actually put them into action. So as Nikisha touched on, we must stop relying on just media training, but then shift that training aspect into actual values alignment and leadership coaching. So the bottom line here is that we don't want our spokespeople to be media trained robots. The fact of the matter is that they're real people, and real people have values that they adhere to. This also means that it's key to recognize when someone might not be the correct speaker for a specific topic. So let's look at a few examples. All of these spokespeople have already nailed that authenticity and accountability aspects of comms, but now they're putting it into action. So the first example here is of Lego. So the Lego CMO, Julia Goldin, spoke about how the company drives growth by exploring what purpose means for the organization. So Lego doesn't just say what their values are, they actually put their values of education, representation, and sustainability into action. And they reinforce these values both in their products as well as in their company culture. So by putting these values into everything they do, this allows them to then grow their business. The second example here is of Microsoft's Satya Nadella speaking out about climate change. Microsoft announced an ambitious green plan intended to eliminate its carbon footprint. Then Satya Nadella, the CEO of the largest software company in the world, said that capitalism will fundamentally be in jeopardy if business does not act on climate change. And this is such an impactful statement coming from him, since he's so deeply intertwined in the world of business and capitalism. So then not only is he elevating Microsoft's green plan, but his statement then becomes a call to action for other companies to follow suit. So he's using his own company's initiatives and his own platform for good. And then finally, our last example here is around tech company Expensify. Expensify is actually one we follow a lot because the CEO has been vocal on his social and political values in the past. When his company announced this policy where all employees vote on their fellow workers' pay, we were not surprised at all because time and time again, he does such a great job of putting his beliefs into action, whether they're mainstream or not. So this is a great example of him, really believing in this new idea and putting his values into a real tangible thing. That this is something that no other company that we know of has done before. So This is just a great example of him putting his values into action. And so taking this a step further, even the often controversial opinions and decisions have a place in comms. As long as they're coming from a well-informed, knowledgeable place, these decisions that CEOs have to make can oftentimes be really difficult and sometimes controversial, but coming from a well-informed and values-driven place, these decisions will be much better received. So we'll look at a few examples of what this looks like. So Zillow, for example, had to shut down a full section of its business because the unit was lagging and could harm the entire company. For Lush, they made the difficult decision to deactivate all of their social media accounts in response to growing concerns about the mental health effects of social media. So these are two examples where CEOs do have to make tough and often controversial decisions. But in both of these cases, the company made the right move in preemptively taking action and transparently communicating the thought process behind these decisions. And in the long run, they were doing what was best for their company. And the final example here is when Jack Dorsey stepped down as CEO from Twitter. I'm sure some of you saw this tweet because it went viral, but in his letter to his employees announcing his resignation, he wrote at the end, "P.S. I'm tweeting this email. My one wish is for Twitter Inc. to be the most transparent company in the world." He then tweeted the full letter out, being completely transparent in his action. And not only did he say that transparency was his hope for Twitter, but he was fully embodying that, doing that, and then acting on that. So then the rest of his company, can take that and also fully believe that is what he believes as well.
All right. So we know what the 3 A's of resilient leadership look like for exec communications, but what does it actually look like when it's applied to an external audience like the media? In our webinar, if you joined us last year, we highlighted just how much change the media landscape was undergoing because of the COVID pandemic, the rise in racial tensions, just everything that was 2020 that led us into 2021. We saw beat shifts, we saw massive widespread layoffs. Well, the environment heading into 2022 is still demanding and still shifting, but it's shifting in a different way. We're seeing publications build back their newsrooms, but focusing on very specific areas and expertise. So how do you stay a step ahead of the media going into 2022? First is, and this one is more high level, is everything is on the record. We've seen this year rollouts from publications like The Verge, starting with The Verge, and going across courts and Wired, changing their policies to be very explicit in there's no more on background conversations unless explicitly stated. That means that your internal communications is your external communications, whether that's emails, memos, phone conversations, assuming that everything you say can and might show up in print. And being able to, that puts you and your team, the executive and spokesperson, forcing to stand by what you're saying and putting that words into action, authenticity, accountability, and holding everyone to that same level. It's something that we've seen develop across social media, while specifically The Verge and Wired and Courts enacted policies and updated policies around this. We saw people from the likes of Forbes, Protocol, Axios, editors across the board vocalize their what's the word I'm looking for? Not necessarily desire, but approval of this type of policy and desire to move more towards this type of way of thinking. Second is taking note and advantage of where publications are building back. They're launching new verticals and business focuses like sustainability, climate change, everything across the board. And so when we look specifically into what these look like from media and what they want to build, what they're expecting from their C-suite, they want to get ahead of these talking points. And so when we look at so for the next slide, having some of those examples of what it looks like for Bloomberg and CNBC, a lot of it's like the equity talks. They want to bring new voices forward. CNBC shifting new editors and reporters who have been previously covered enterprise tech, emerging technology, to focus specifically in how are these technologies building a more sustainable future. I think a really interesting quote that came from Karen Ho, the senior reporter of sustainability at Business Insider. She talked about how she's been in the business journalism her entire career. And it's interesting to see how sustainability is no longer a niche topic, but a C-suite role at a lot of companies. And so she recently started, I want to say the back half of last year, focusing specifically on sustainable topics from the C-suite and how it's impacting them. So when we think about the priorities driving these publications, they want to pull in experts and voices in these new vertical areas, business focus areas that are impacting individuals, consumers, and people alike, not just businesses. When we look at them, how they're diving into new mediums like TikTok and YouTube. Don't know if you've been seeing, but like YouTube has been a growing area for someone like Wall Street Journal, who's been pulling in a number of reporters and launching very specific YouTube channels. Like for Dalvin Brown, also Daniela Hernandez, we see Sal Rodriguez head over there and will likely start his own channel as well, focusing on pulling in these younger generational audiences like Gen Z and producing more visual content and storytelling. What's also really interesting to see how these publishers are building back and are being forced to maneuver across the new landscape is new competitor sets almost emerging. We know from a comms perspective, we talk a lot about influencer work, right? How do we work with influencers to build our brands for us and speak for us as well? This is no different for publishers. We look at something like Twitch and influencers on Twitch. When a person can beat out established publications like the Financial Times, Insider, Wall Street Journal for the first interview with a major sports athlete in a recent trade across football or soccer teams, that's business impactful for these publishers. And so understanding that new challenge that they're facing of having to not only compete with other publishers, but also influencers across these new platforms, it gives you that extra lens of, okay, getting a sense of what's driving what they want and how they're interacting with your executives. And again, visual storytelling is really where it's at. How do you provide the assets needed and prepare your executive to show up in these different formats and features to make sure that they're showing up as best as they can and being able to help be a helpful resource for these reporters. Getting familiar with these publications, where they want to go, their desired audiences, how they're shifting and the nuances of their hirings or tweaks, and not just the reporter and editor level, but even behind the scenes for like marketing and pushing out, helps you become a better resource and a spokesperson be a better resource for these reporters and editors. So what that looks like is not only prepping and making sure that you can navigate and address any questions that may be proposed during an interview, but also having like assets ready that are going to be more dynamic, more engaging, and ready at that prompt to be able to help them tell a more clickable, relatable, shareable story as well.
Great. And so as we start to get towards the end of our presentation here, do want to do a little recap of the 3 A's and some specific suggestions on, sort of the first step in implementing each into your comms program. Always start by taking accountability, not just being accountable when something is going wrong, but proactively talking about accountability and being as transparent as you can, especially with employees. Think about finding ways to make sure your spokespeople are sharing accountability with each other, and that you're pairing the right subject matter experts to the right conversations and not leaving the CEO on an island to be the only voice. One immediate implementation to become more accountable as an organization is to become more accountable as a comms team. So something to consider is, do you have a mission statement for how transparent you want to be and can be within the bounds of the information that you can release? And what does that look like from an employee perspective? I think just a framing mission statement is a great way for a business to sort of get its direction right. It's also a nice way for a comms team to adopt this sort of new value set. Next up, we talked about becoming more authentic, and how do you make that happen? How do you bring real emotions and connections into your comms processes and strategies to go beyond media training? Help spokespeople get and stay authentic in their interactions, both with media and really bring those values into all of their conversations within and outside a company. Aligning your speaker's bench behind values, making sure they understand how those values dictate not just business decisions, but communications interactions. And then finally, actionable. So really to frame all of this, not waiting, put this in action now. Start making an investment in your comms organization to bring the human element forward. Doing that within comms is first and foremost, to making that happen as an organization. Also, go back to media training. It's not just training someone how to do an interview, but to provide leadership and values-oriented coaching. So your spokespeople are on the same page as the organization and each other about these really important conversations that are popping up in more and more places, as Charlene took us through. So hopefully our analysis and recommendations here have given you a few new ideas on how to do this, or at least driven a sense of urgency to start thinking about it, both personally and for your org. With that said, thank you for joining today. We'll switch over to the Q&A in a second here, but if you're interested in speaking further about any of these issues or learning about our services, please do fill out the intake form, which we'll link in the chat. Please follow us on social, smash that like button, subscribe to our newsletter. We do share out interesting content and ideas pretty frequently. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming, and happy to open it up to a Q&A.
Perfect. I think, John, one of the first questions I think would be great to start with comes from Mike from the beginning of the presentation. Though you note that the era of the know-it-all CEO is over, it seems there are more and more issues that our leaders are asked or even required to lead on. How do you prioritize and determine when to have our leaders speak out on issues and when they should defer to other leaders in organizations, such as a chief diversity officer on DE&I matters?
Yeah, great question. And, I think it really speaks to the authenticity element here. I think when it comes down to it, you need to put the most authentic and valid voice forward. I think in some cases that can be the CEO plus someone. So if you do have a chief diversity officer, I absolutely believe that person should be part of any conversations. But similar to how the CEO doesn't have to do it alone, I don't think the chief diversity officer has to do it alone either. And, while reporters, as we know, will always push us to, I just want to talk to the CEO, as part of our process as comms professionals, we can push back and say, listen, this is really an area where so-and-so, the chief diversity officer, has been making a lot of strategic investments and transformations, and they need to be a part of this too, and the CEO wants them to be. So there's not, I would say, a perfect answer to that, because there is sort of this push and pull of people wanting the CEO and expecting the CEO. But I think as comms professionals, our job is to make sure that the rest, there is an expanded speaker bench out there that's equipped, and that you do have this sort of at least initial sell-in from the CEO of, let's tackle it like a team.
Definitely. And I would add to that as well. I mean, I think especially when you're comparing the CEO to that other bench, there is a certain level, right, that the CEO does have to lean in and speak and address these kind of comments at a certain level. But when it comes to going in deep and really providing that company POV, like how can they be an advocate and help elevate these other voices on their bench to speak on it as well? But from a CEO view, being able to speak from high level, business impactful, this is why it's important to our organization. And now talk to this person who's really showing how it's being executed and how it's coming to life within the org.
I think from an authenticity standpoint too, I kind of think about, when we're trying to decide who's going to be most authentic to speak about X, Y, and Z, right? We have to do a little bit of digging into them personally. We have to, who's going to make you feel like they know what they're talking about might be different than whose background and college degree could otherwise tell you that they know what they're talking about, right? And so we've shifted a little bit more into that space where it's that human element going forward. And it is, it's a process of message mapping. How do we do some intake calls with executives and get to know them, get to know, what fires them up? Why do they think the way they think? Why do they lead the way they lead? And sometimes in that process, we uncover topics that they can own that are not ones that are in their typical job description. They're just ones that they speak to really naturally. And that's what we want for authenticity.
question that came through the chat that I think builds on that really nicely is, what do you think is or should be the role and responsibility of the CMO in these conversations and messages? And Meg, I think you had that great example of the Lego CMO in your slides as well, of what that can look like.
Yeah, and it does go back to what Nikisha was just saying, you know, about the values in that intake call process. The CMO does really drive a lot of that values driven, in the example of the Lego CMO, that kind of purpose driven messaging. And I know for Lego, for example, they put their values not only into their products, but into their employee comms and their external comms. And so I think the role of the CMO is really making sure that those values do come through, not just externally, but also internally with your employees. Because if your employees don't believe what the company values are, then no one else will. So I think that is a really important aspect of the CMO role in this particular example, and in this, you know, kind of aligning company values externally and internally.
Awesome. And then I think I got to scroll up. We had another question in the chat about the Microsoft CEO. The Microsoft CEO statement about climate change is nice and important, but it's missing the action element. What did the company subsequently do to demonstrate the commitment that he spoke of?
Yeah, so Microsoft had basically, Satya Nadella's comment came after Microsoft announced their green plan, which was intended to eliminate its carbon footprint. And Microsoft's goal now actually is to be carbon negative by 2030. So basically, Microsoft put this plan into action. And then after the fact, Satya Nadella, you know, made that call out for other companies to follow suit as well, and kind of just supplemented their action with his authentic statement after the fact.
I think it's also interesting when you're talking at someone, you know, at the level of Satya Nadella, where he's one of the most visible CEOs, you know, in business today. It's almost taking a stance is taking action for someone that notable and so big. So there's almost sort of this, it's a bit going into accountability too. But I think just by virtue that he's willing to talk about it and make it part of the conversation is almost like taking action. But to Meg's point, you know, then you do have to follow through, even if you're as big and important as Satya.
Awesome. And I think I missed one of the questions at the beginning part. I'm going to combine this with one other question as well, is should leaders and executives be more authentic in their comms? And on the flip side of that, like, how do you handle an executive who doesn't come across authentic or isn't quite as coachable either?
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have right now, right? Is, you know, we do want more authenticity as consumers. I mean, I think most of us as consumers would say, yes, we want more authenticity. I don't want a canned comment from an executive. I don't want marketing lingo. I want to know what they really think, what they feel, what they're doing about their business, what direction they're going in, what changes they're making in. I care about things on a human level. And we see so much of that changing buying power too, with, you know, younger generations, Gen Z coming in, and, you know, they aren't brand loyal as much, especially when it comes down to their values. And what we can do about that is really focus on authenticity. So I think when we have executives that maybe are not, just don't feel like a naturally authentic person, that is the challenge of, you know, I think the previous mindset was, well, how do we train them to be? And sometimes we can't. Sometimes that's not the approach. Sometimes it is, let's build the speaker bench around them so that they're surrounded by other leaders and other parts of our executive bench who can authentically talk about certain issues so that they can focus on what they're really good at speaking about. So, you know, Netflix, I think, was our example of where they had accountability, but the authenticity kind of failed. Their CEO is still possible, like is still capable of talking about their business vision and where their business is going, but he's not an authentically good person to speak about issues like diversity and inclusion. But they have people who can, right? So it's noticing that and realizing when we can kind of say, okay, the CEO doesn't have to take all of this, or just because it's tech related, it doesn't have to be the CTO. Just because it's finance, it doesn't have to be the CFO. It's kind of breaking those walls and saying who can speak to this? How do we build up the people around them? And then how do we do that leadership and values alignment coaching to really find what they can speak to strongly so that we set them up for success.
Love that. I think that's especially that last piece as well, that value coaching and alignment. Like values play such a big role, right? In the comms that we see playing out, whether that's internal or external, as well as what's the values of the organization and what is the values of the spokespeople that we use, and how do we find that kind of alignment and coaching of how does this value resonate with you, and finding that kind of message point versus, I feel like often, right, we approach it from a comms view of here's the key messages, here's how you approach it, more so that media training versus coaching. And we're seeing so much more of that shift to coach versus train as well. Love that.
Yeah, and that's sort of the transformation we were talking about at the start, right? It's not just change. It's really almost going, as comms people, going out of our comfort zones a little bit and, say, well, that is the way we always did it, but let's reimagine what this looks like, and let's make it more human. So it's not easy, right? That's why it's transformation and not just change. But, I think we feel, and hopefully you feel, that it's worth the investment to do so.
Awesome. And then another question coming in the chat: are certain comms vehicles viewed both by employees but also by external stakeholders as more authentic than others? For instance, do you have any evidence that demonstrates that a CEO's participation in a Zoom town hall might be better than a blog post in terms of authenticity? I'd say, I know we all have the thoughts there. I think it really depends on what's the message that you're trying to put out there, and what makes sense for the audience you're trying to reach. I think if it's the level and the gravitas of what you're trying to address and share, does it warrant your CEO or executive showing up in a more personalized face-to-face or Zoom meeting manner, or can it be a blog post? I think also when you think about those external stakeholders, knowing, are you trying to externally reinforce what you want to be said before dealing with what's going on in your internal house? And that's what I think is so interesting, looking specifically at the media, is that we see more of that type of shift of internal comms being external. Like I think that Twitter CEO email example is a perfect example of that. Like we can go out and externally post like, hey, we have a new CEO shift as well. But what can be seen even more authentic is going and talking to your internal comms, and they end up being your voices for the organization too, and sharing, hey, this is how they've come across, this is how they're sharing the news, rather than seeming almost like a controlled of the media narrative too.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is to embrace sort of the employee first element of it too. So if you're doing a blog post and it's relevant for employees, make sure that it also comes alongside something more personal and direct to employees, like a Zoom town hall.
I think a lot of that goes to the rise of the remote workforce as well. The more we're virtual, I think that was a big shift. And a lot of 2020, we spent coaching executives on, not just when to go on Zoom, but what should they look like when they get on Zoom? How do they set up their virtual setup so that they can be the most trustworthy people? We've done surveys in the industry, and we found that people being at eye level versus having a computer down or up, significantly changed how much people trusted the person who was speaking. It changed how much they thought of them as a leader. And those are not negligible things. Those are things that really need to be accounted for. And is going to continue. It's not just a COVID thing. It's not just a, new normal thing. It really is how we're going to see remote work and distributed workforces need to be communicated with as well.
And I think this is the last question, unless anyone else has anything to drop in, but what does this look like in practice? How do you have this conversation with your stakeholders and with your spokespeople? How do you reevaluate your comms plan against the 3 A's?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, number one is it has to start within the comms team, as we sort of discussed, create that mission statement that guides your approach to accountability, authenticity, and action, and define it for your organization, right? Because those things, you know, as we know, they can mean different things to different people. So define it, come up with what that means exactly for your comms strategy. I think that's the best way to get started. And then from there, you know, it's selling in more people and getting up to the CMO, and then a plan for what that transformation looks like. Which processes are you going to change to embrace this, which need to stay the same, and starting to get really tactical about it.
Yep. And I think examples, I think you mentioned it, John, bring those forward from media perspective, showcasing how people are being interpreted and coming across, what came across well, what didn't come across well. A lot of these executives, right? We've been working with them. They've been working with media for years as well. So there's that level of understanding that they think they have it, but they're not as in step of the current media landscape, how that's shifting expectations. And so as comms professionals, being able to provide those examples and help prepare them as well to shift and have those conversations that's needed is definitely going to be helpful.
Great. So I think last call for any questions. Otherwise, we really appreciate your time and attention coming in here. And yeah, would love to connect over email, socials, smash that like button, chat with us. And again, thank you for the time.
Thanks, everyone.